I am Willow Benton, and I can talk about this only because the truth came out before everything fell apart beyond fixing. It started when my phone lit up with a message from my sister Darcy. The screen showed her words in a single line that made my chest feel tight, as if someone had pulled the floor out from under me. She wrote, "I deleted your med school application because now you cannot compete with me." The confidence in her voice echoed in my mind while I stared at the message, unable to believe that she would go that far simply to stay ahead of me. I barely had time to breathe before my phone rang again. This time it was the dean from the medical school I had applied to. The call felt unreal, as if the world had changed without warning. The dean said, "We checked the system logs. You have been accepted with a full scholarship." I could not respond before she continued with another sentence that changed everything. She said, "Your sister is blacklisted from all medical schools effective immediately." The shock came in waves when I learned that Darcy's acceptance letter had been taken away while she was celebrating with friends. It was the moment I realized that the story I had been living with for years was about to fall apart in ways neither of us expected. So I decided to finally tell the truth about what happened and why this disaster did not begin today. If you want to follow this journey and understand how everything reached this point, make sure you stay with me, leave a comment, and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. My earliest memories always carried a quiet awareness of where I stood in my own home, and that awareness grew sharper each year in ways I could not ignore. Even when I tried to make myself small enough to escape notice, my mother Janice made it clear through countless choices that my sister Darcy deserved the center of attention, especially during moments that shaped the daily rhythm of our family. The pattern never arrived with dramatic declarations, since it came through subtle actions that piled up until they became impossible to misunderstand, and I learned to move through the household with careful steps to avoid becoming an inconvenience. My father, Bill, rarely challenged the imbalance because he believed silence kept the peace. Yet his silence did nothing beyond reinforcing the idea that Darcy's wants mattered more than any explanation I might try to offer. Whether we disagreed over simple decisions or more personal matters, Darcy always got the benefit of the doubt, and I understood that Dad would back away from the conversation instead of questioning her version of events. His avoidance created an atmosphere where conflict never got resolved because the outcome had been decided long before anyone opened their mouth. I felt the weight of that reality, even when I was too young to put it into words. The contrast between how we were treated became more visible once school responsibilities entered the picture, since I had to manage most of my academic needs without waiting for permission or support. Darcy received new supplies, extra help, and encouragement whenever she had difficulty, while I learned to stretch every resource and solve problems quietly to avoid hearing that my concerns were not urgent. Although Mom insisted she wanted both daughters to succeed, her actions rarely show those claims, and I realized that relying on myself meant fewer disappointments. It shaped me into someone who double-checked every assignment, organized every schedule, and worked through confusion alone because expecting balanced attention felt unrealistic. As time passed, I developed a habit of holding back any accomplishment that might attract unnecessary attention, especially achievements that risked creating tension with Darcy. Sharing good news often resulted in comparisons that made my efforts seem smaller, and I preferred protecting my progress from criticism rather than forcing enthusiasm from people who had already chosen their favorite. Darcy never needed to hide her victories because Mom celebrated each milestone with enthusiasm that filled the entire house, and those celebrations often came with comments suggesting I should consider following her example. The suggestion always sounded harmless on the surface, yet it carried a hint that my own path lacked value unless it looked like hers. Small interactions revealed the depth of our divide more clearly than major events because daily routines exposed differences that felt built into the way our family worked. Darcy rarely lifted a finger to complete household tasks unless someone reminded her, while I handled chores without prompting to avoid accusations that I failed to contribute. When decisions involved shared privileges, such as choosing weekend activities or inviting friends over, Darcy's preferences shaped the final outcome even when I voiced alternatives, and Mom rarely considered whether the plan suited me as well. These moments stacked together like quiet confirmations that my comfort ranked lower, no matter how reasonable my suggestions might be. One memory in particular solidified the understanding that my voice carried little weight. During a dinner conversation, Darcy blamed me for a misunderstanding involving a school project we had both worked on separately, and her accusation twisted what really happened in a way that placed responsibility entirely on my shoulders. I tried to clarify what had actually happened, yet Mom interrupted before I could finish, insisting that Darcy would never lie about something so minor. Dad looked down at his plate to avoid participating, and I realized that no amount of explanation would change their view. I swallowed my frustration because continuing the discussion felt pointless, and that moment taught me how little space existed for my perspective within the structure of our family. 2 years before the application season began, a subtle shift in my routine set everything in motion. I had joined a STEM enrichment program at the community college, and one of the guest instructors introduced herself to me as a mentor named Dr. Ellen Rosewood. She carried a calm confidence that drew students toward her, yet she was sharp enough to notice quiet effort long before it produced visible results. During a lab session, she paused by my station, studied the notes I had arranged around the microscope, and asked a few precise questions that revealed how closely she had been watching my progress. Her attention surprised me, because most adults around me rarely noticed my work unless it related to tasks at home, but she focused on the choices I made rather than the noise around me. I felt something loosen inside my chest as she explained why certain details in my report showed the kind of discipline required for medical training. Dr. Rosewood invited me to stay after class for a conversation about long-term goals, and I found myself speaking freely in a way that felt new. She listened with her arms relaxed against the desk and asked what I wanted rather than what my family preferred. The question created an unexpected silence, because I had answered according to other people's expectations for so long that I struggled to form a thought that belonged only to me. When she encouraged me to build an independent academic profile, I sensed that she was offering the first real permission I had ever received to imagine a future that did not circle around family politics. Her encouragement stayed in my mind during the bus ride home, shaping ideas that had never been allowed to take form. Darcy noticed the change before I fully understood it. Moments that used to pass without tension began to carry a new edge when she realized I spent more time studying than trying to stay out of the way. She asked about assignments in an overly casual tone, her eyes searching for any sign that I might be closing the distance she believed belonged to her. Compliments from teachers heightened the shift because Darcy stiffened whenever someone described my work as promising. I tried to ignore it, yet her reactions revealed a fear she had never admitted. She had assumed there would always be space between us because I was the quiet one, and her certainty began to crack when other adults recognized my potential. At home, my parents continued patterns that had been in place for years. They planned weekend activities centered on Darcy's competitions and rarely paused to ask whether I needed rides for program meetings or volunteer hours. Conversations around the dinner table often circled Darcy's goals, while my updates landed softly and slid out of focus. I would sit with my hands folded under the table, waiting for appropriate moments to speak, only to watch my words disappear beneath louder opinions. The distance between Darcy and me widened because I learned not to interrupt, and she never learned to make space for anyone else. What might have been normal sibling rivalry turned into a quiet imbalance that shaped the decisions I made during that period. As weeks passed, I kept attending sessions with Dr. Rosewood, who guided me toward research opportunities and personal essays that reflected my own voice rather than convenient stories. She reminded me that independent work could serve as a foundation if family dynamics made it difficult to rely on support at home. Her advice influenced how I approached everything from lab assignments to study schedules, and her steady confidence gave me a sense of direction that did not require outside permission. I realized I could move forward even when no one at home noticed the effort. Darcy grew more reactive as my accomplishments became harder to overlook. She frowned when I returned from meetings with new ideas, and she interrupted conversations when someone praised my initiative. It became clear that every step I took toward a medical career threatened the image she held of herself. I watched her discomfort spread through ordinary interactions, yet I did not challenge her because I knew arguing would only reinforce her belief that we were competitors rather than sisters. Instead, I kept my intentions close to my chest, aware that revealing too much would invite pushback. By the time the idea of applying to medical school began to feel real, I had learned to protect my choices. I completed forms on my own, stayed late in the library without mentioning the reason, and organized deadlines in a notebook I kept inside my backpack. I felt a quiet resolve building in my thoughts as I realized how far momentum could carry me when I did not seek approval. Although the path ahead remained uncertain, I decided to move forward without sharing more than necessary. Some goals require silence until they are strong enough to stand on their own, and mine had finally reached that point. A few months later, the steady rhythm of daily tasks shifted into a phase marked by decisions that seemed to carry more weight with every passing week. Darcy moved through the beginning stages of her preparation with a certainty that never wavered because Mom offered constant support throughout each step. They reviewed practice materials together at the dining table, and Mom bought test guides within days of Darcy mentioning them. Conversations about application fees or tutoring schedules unfolded with an ease that revealed how naturally the path aligned with their expectations, and I observed the routine from a quiet distance as I arranged my own responsibilities. I handled grocery lists for the evenings when both of them stayed busy, and I worked additional shifts at a campus cafe to cover enrollment in preparatory programs that I needed for my application. Dad occasionally asked if Darcy needed transportation to review sessions, yet he never paused long enough to consider whether my schedule demanded similar attention. I learned to handle obligations without relying on help because requests often produced more questions than solutions. Balancing work with coursework required planning that stretched across notebooks and calendars, and I developed new habits to stay alert during late hours since shifts ended close to midnight on certain days. The effort strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it, because each completed assignment showed that progress remained possible even when support came from internal discipline rather than outside reassurance. During this period, a friend of mine, Riley Camden, noticed how tightly I held my schedule together. Riley had a calm presence that made difficult conversations feel manageable, and our study sessions developed a natural rhythm whenever we met in the Student Union building. Riley never pressed for personal details about Darcy or the atmosphere at home, but encouraged steady focus during afternoons when exhaustion threatened to slow my pace. Those conversations created space for thoughts that often remained unspoken because Riley recognized the difference between venting and strategic reflection. I found comfort in the consistency of those moments, and the support fortified my concentration during long weeks of preparation. After this phase, Riley stepped back and returned to personal projects, allowing the story to move forward without continuing that role. Meanwhile, Darcy began asking pointed questions about my progress with a tone that sounded casual but carried an unmistakable undercurrent. She asked how many schools I planned to include, which deadlines applied to early submissions, and whether I intended to attend certain workshops. Something in her expression sharpened whenever I hesitated before responding, and I sensed a pressure that had little to do with genuine interest. Her questions shaped an invisible boundary between us, and the air shifted whenever I tried to explain that I preferred handling my preparations privately. Darcy never confronted the matter directly, yet her attempts to gather information continued each week. The intention behind those questions taught me to measure my responses carefully because sharing details rarely produced helpful dialogue. I adjusted my routine to guard information, and I created separate folders on my laptop containing drafts of essays and lists of personal achievements. Passwords changed regularly, and I reviewed browsing histories to make sure that no one accessed files without permission. I carried essential documents on a flash drive that remained clipped inside a zippered compartment in my backpack. These small precautions strengthened my awareness of how vulnerable academic materials could become when curiosity exceeded healthy boundaries. Silence became a strategy that allowed me to progress without feeling exposed, and the decision restored a sense of control that had worn away under previous circumstances. Throughout this period, Dr. Rosewood introduced me to techniques that protected digital files, including ways to track unusual login attempts and identify changes in online forms. She emphasized the importance of vigilance when working within systems that housed confidential information, and her guidance showed gaps in my understanding of basic security practices. We reviewed submission platforms together, and she showed subtle indicators that signaled unauthorized activity. I applied each method without drawing attention to the changes, and I refined habits that made sure my materials remained intact. Her support shaped a protective structure that surrounded my efforts, and her instruction elevated my confidence in handling both academic responsibilities and the subtleties of personal boundaries. By the time early deadlines approached, The contrast between Darcy's preparation and my own had become crystal clear. She flourished under constant reinforcement at home, while I strengthened resolve through independent work shaped by necessity rather than preference. The quiet discipline that defined my path carried weight that no one else seemed to notice, yet I felt the momentum building. Each completed step confirmed that persistence could develop behind closed doors, and I embraced the idea that meaningful progress thrives in silence when the foundation remains protected from interference. 3 weeks before decisions were released, the foundation of my efforts gave way beneath me in a manner that felt both sudden and strangely calculated. I logged into the application portal after finishing a late study session, expecting nothing more than a routine glance at my checklist. Yet the screen froze as an alert flashed across the dashboard. My file appeared as incomplete, and multiple documents that I had uploaded months earlier no longer showed any trace of having existed. The quiet shock that settled over me felt heavier than panic because it signaled the beginning of something I had suspected yet never thought would reach the scale. I tried to reload the page several times, hoping the system was having a simple delay, although an uneasy certainty kept tightening in my chest. When the missing sections remained unchanged, I reached out to technical support and explained what I had noticed without allowing fear to control my tone. They invited me to stay on the line while they pulled access logs, and the faint clicking on their end created a tension that made every second feel stretched beyond reason. After a brief pause, the technician told me that a login had occurred from a device that did not match any of my registered hardware identifiers, and the timestamp lined up almost perfectly with the moment my documents disappeared. The confirmation struck with a clarity that forced me to acknowledge the possibility that someone had targeted my file on purpose. I felt a wave of cold suspicion before I even checked my messages, almost as if my mind had reached the conclusion before the evidence appeared. When I opened my phone, a new notification waited at the top of the screen, and my breath stopped the instant I recognized the sender. Darcy had written a single message, and her words landed with the precision of a confession. "I deleted your med school application. Now you can't compete with me." I read the sentence twice, stunned by the ease with which she admitted her involvement, although the bluntness of her phrasing revealed a level of certainty that unsettled me more deeply than the theft itself. I forced myself to remain calm because emotional reactions would not restore the lost documents. Instead, I began gathering every record I could find, starting with the access logs that technical support emailed to me immediately after our call. I saved copies into multiple folders, encrypted them, and created a timeline of every change made to my file over the previous month. The pattern became alarmingly clear as I organized the data into a sensible timeline, revealing intentional deletions rather than system errors. Each detail strengthened my resolve, and the quiet determination that settled within me felt vastly different from fear. It felt like the moment a long-standing imbalance finally demanded accountability. Once I had put everything together into a clear summary, I wrote a formal report addressed to the admissions committee. I included Darcy's message, the timestamps of the unauthorized access, and the full documentation provided by technical support. Creating the report required immense focus because I understood that any vagueness could weaken the case, yet the clarity of the evidence created a structure that guided my words with an unexpected steadiness. When I pressed submit, I allowed myself a single moment to acknowledge the weight of what I had done, aware that exposing the truth might change my relationship with Darcy forever. After sending the report, I sat in silence while the possibility of failure drifted through my mind with a heaviness that felt almost physical. I had spent years preparing for this path, shaping every decision around a future I wanted to reach through resilience rather than rivalry. The idea that all of it could collapse because Darcy viewed my ambition as a threat forced me to confront the limits of the bond we once shared. I reminded myself that protecting my work was not an act of aggression, but an act of preservation, and the distinction allowed me to breathe again despite the uncertainty stretching ahead. I ended the night, knowing that the outcome might remain out of my control, yet I refused to surrender the story of my efforts to someone who believed sabotage could shape her victory. The fear remained, although it stood beside a growing conviction that I had done everything within my power to defend the years I had invested. 2 days after I submitted my report, a call arrived that carried a weight I felt immediately even before I answered. The tone of the dean was calm yet unmistakably firm, and I realized they would not have reached out directly unless the investigation had already reached its conclusion. I steadied my breath as they explained that every entry point into the system had been reviewed with careful attention, and their findings left no room for uncertainty regarding what had happened to my application file. The dean began by stating that the logs revealed a full timeline of unauthorized activity, including specific locations and devices involved in each attempt. When they said the words, "We checked the system logs. You have been accepted with a full scholarship," I felt a wave of disbelief move through me because I had spent days preparing myself for an outcome shaped by sabotage rather than merit. The dean allowed me a quiet moment, then continued with a sentence that landed with a force I had not anticipated, saying, "Your sister is blacklisted from all medical schools effective immediately." I closed my eyes as my thoughts tried to make sense of the relief of validation with the sorrow of knowing how far Darcy had gone and how irreversible the consequences now were. The dean described how their team traced the unauthorized access to a hotspot registered to Darcy, and each attempt lined up perfectly with the periods when my documents began to shift or disappear. They told me that her status changed the moment the evidence was verified, which included the automatic cancellation of her acceptance into their preparatory program. Hours later, word reached me that Darcy's offer had been taken away in the middle of a networking event she attended with the confidence of someone convinced her future was secure. I imagined her expression as staff members asked her to step aside, and although I felt no satisfaction in her embarrassment, I could not ignore the fact that her choices had carried her there without hesitation or restraint. The consequences she faced no longer had anything to do with me and everything to do with the decisions she believed she had the right to make. Mom reacted with fierce anger once the news reached her, insisting that I must have manipulated the situation or exaggerated my claims to destroy Darcy's chances. She demanded explanations I no longer felt obligated to give, while Dad tried to calm her and urged her to consider that my evidence had spoken for itself. His attempts failed to shift her conviction, and I listened in silence as both of them argued in the background, realizing that their conflict had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with loyalty they had reserved for only one daughter. I ended the day with a strange sense of stillness because the truth had finally been spoken aloud by those with the authority to see the full picture, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to change shape rather than deepen. In the weeks that followed, I tried to understand the shape of my new reality. The investigation had closed, yet the consequences continued to unfold in ways I had never anticipated. Darcy struggled to find opportunities anywhere near the field she once declared herself destined for, and every rejection carried the same reason hidden between the lines. Programs were unwilling to overlook a violation linked to academic integrity, and her frustration grew sharper each time she tried to convince others she had been wronged. Watching this from a distance felt surreal because the outcome she now faced was created by choices she made with absolute confidence. Mom refused to accept any explanation, even though she had already reviewed the documentation the school sent. Her certainty that I had manipulated everything remained unshaken, and each conversation with her became a cycle of accusations that refused to change. She insisted that families should protect one another, yet her definition of protection had always been stretched to cover only one person. Listening to her voice shift between disappointment and anger reminded me of every moment she expected me to stay quiet for the sake of maintaining an image that never belonged to me. Dad reached out more often, and although his intentions were gentler, the distance between us had widened in ways neither of us knew how to bridge. He apologized for not seeing the situation clearly, but apologies alone could not untangle the pattern of silence that shaped our family for years. I sensed that he wanted me to come home or allow conversations to return to their old rhythm, yet doing so would mean accepting the same imbalance that pushed me aside for so long. I answered his calls with patience, but each exchange reminded me how far I had already stepped away from that environment. I moved into a small apartment near the University of Wisconsin Hospital as the semester approached. The space felt unfamiliar at first, yet it represented a beginning built entirely from my own perseverance rather than anyone else's approval. I organized my textbooks, arranged my schedule, and allowed myself to imagine a future defined by effort rather than rivalry. Preparing for orientation gave me a sense of steadiness because the work ahead finally lined up with everything I had hoped to pursue without interference. A long message from Darcy appeared on my phone one evening. She wrote about her regret, her anger toward the consequences she now faced, and her belief that I should understand why she acted the way she did. Reading her words stirred a complicated mix of emotions, yet I knew responding would only reopen conflicts that never led anywhere meaningful. Silence became my decision, not from spite, but from the understanding that repeating old arguments would only keep both of us tied to a past that had already revealed its truth. As the weeks settled into something steadier, I realized that moving forward required me to protect the progress I had fought for. The distance from my family was not an escape but a boundary long overdue, and for the first time, I felt free to shape a life without waiting for their permission. Just before the start of the semester, I made the final choice that had been forming quietly in the background. I realized that the only way to enter this new chapter with clarity was to remove the emotional noise that had shadowed my life for far too long. Cutting contact with Mom and Darcy was not an impulsive reaction, but the outcome of months spent understanding how deeply their expectations had shaped my sense of worth. I deleted their numbers, muted every thread that used to anchor me to conflicts I had never created, and allowed myself a silence that felt unfamiliar yet necessary. Dad wrote a letter a few days later. His handwriting carried a hesitation I recognized instantly, and his words reflected a sadness I knew was real. He wished things had unfolded differently, and admitted he feared the distance between us would harden into something permanent. Reading it left me with a heaviness that did not feel like guilt, but rather the quiet grief of letting go of something that had been fragile for years. I kept the letter in a drawer, not to revisit the past, but to acknowledge that some connections require space before they can become healthy. Living on my own gave me the chance to see how often I had doubted myself in the past. I began to see that the strength I carried had come not from approval, but from persistence born in solitude. I understood that my resilience had never been a coincidence. Every night I reviewed study materials, prepared for the first orientation sessions, and reminded myself that my path no longer needed to measure itself against anyone else's progress. There were moments when memories came back, and I wondered whether a different choice might have changed the outcome, yet I always returned to the same understanding. Compromise only works when both sides want healing, and nothing in the past months showed any willingness from Mom or Darcy to examine the harm they created.